What's up, everybody? Michael or Control Freak here. We had a really successful 5-0 trophy league with Dimir Shadow, and I decided to make a couple little adjustments just for the heck of it, see what happened. Played through two more leagues. I'm gonna have both of those here for you. Two different videos because we want to stick to that 30-minute time frame or whatnot. So this is the first league with a variation of that Dimir shell. I decided to swap around a little bit. Threw in a search for Azcanta because that was a card that I was interested in trying out. Swapped the fourth Murktide for the first Brazen Borrower. So we'll see if that ends up showing up. And the sideboard made a few changes, adding in some Spreading Seas, the Fluster Storms, a second Subtlety, Go for the Throat, cut a second Engineer Explosives, added a Chalice of the Void. Sideboard's just a whole mess on its own, but I kind of wanted to try out some stuff that I've been liking in the sideboard with a little more of Tintin's main deck configuration, just to see how things kind of lined up. So let's go ahead and hop into this league, see how things progress. We'll have to wait a second for it to throw off screen. And wait for it, wait for it, wait for it. Back on screen. There we go. All right, so round number one, win a die roll on the play. Love to see it. Okay, opening hand. We've got interaction. We've got a counter spell. We've got lands. We've got a redraw with this consider. So we know consider is looking for a threat. Find a Thoughtseize. I'd rather hold up Counterspell here. If I had a Shadow, then maybe I'm Thoughtseizing, but I don't know what I'm up against yet, so I really don't want to be too aggressive. With Thoughtseize, we see we're up against this fair Calibrated deck or Calibrated Blast deck. If you haven't seen this deck before, it uses a lot of the Rakdos mid-range elements, the Furies, the Fable of the Mirror Breakers, stuff like that, and then uses Witch's Cottage to put something like a Scion of Draco or a Shadow of Mortality back on top of your library, and then you Calibrated Blast into it, so you're guaranteed that 12 plus damage, whatever. But we do get to ditch a couple Calibrated Blasts. I'm trying to get those in the yard so my opponent can't cast them multiple times. And since I've got Dismember to answer this Scion, I'm not too worried about Fury because I don't have any good targets for it right now. We're just trying to pick up a couple counter spells so we can stop the Calibrated Blast from doing anything too scary. And then we'll kind of deal with Scion and Shadow of Mortality, whatnot, as they come down. But if opponent doesn't hit the fifth land, then we don't care so much about Calibrated Blast. Try to pull ahead on cards a little bit. Unfortunately, our opponent does have this Leyline Binding, so we know that they could answer the Shadow. We just kind of have to be a little lucky. They can do a blind Calibrated Blast flip here. Or I'd say blind. They had the second fetch land for the Witch's Cottage. If they didn't have the second fetch land for the cottage, then they either wouldn't have the fifth land for the Calibrated Blast, or they wouldn't be able to put a threat back on top. But the second fetch means that they did. Sideboarding against the Calibrated Blast deck. I'm basically just taking out a bunch of this removal stuff, the fatal pushes and things that don't answer Fury, Scion of Draco, Shadow of Mortality. Spreading Seas is good for cutting a land off of being a swamp, so they might not be able to put back a threat as soon. I don't see myself playing this Search for Azcanta anytime soon, so I'm just going to go ahead and bin that. We're just trying to get Shadow down with a counterspell back up. Territorial Kavu was not on my radar post board at all, which made me really glad that I've got this Dismember, but that could have been scary. But since they got Xander's Lounge, Temple Garden, we know if we Spreading Seas the Xander's Lounge, that's going to take them a ways off of a Witch's Cottage. They're going to need at least their sixth land drop to be able to do that. So we've got a good bit of flexibility here. I want to make sure that I can make this attack into a 2-turn clock, which with their Shadow Prophecy means I just get to hold up double counter spell, and I feel relatively safe from here. Like, I know this Shadow's lethal. I've got the Archmage's Charm as an interactive spell for a secondary threat or a secondary removal spell. Get to nab that onto game 3. Very, very clean game there. Just hand disruption into a threat, counter backup. Really what you want to see out of Dimir. Now this is a one lander on the draw. I know they're not doing anything scary turn 1, so I know I'm gonna have a chance to kind of draw out of this one lander, which is exactly what you see here. Like, thankfully, Street Wraith goes ahead and finds the second land. But we do have the ability to just kind of like get our threats out, get our land drops. We've got a bunch of 1 mana interactions, so I'm pretty okay with just playing out the Shadow aggressively. But I don't want to play the Shadow and protect it and have them untap with 3 mana on a turn where they could play like Calibrated Blast or Fable of the Mirror Breaker or something like that, which is why I just like let the Shadow get bolted. I still got the Murktide. I've got a bunch of interaction to fight over whatever they do until I get to a point where I can play out the Murktide and protect it. And here, because I drew the 5th land, I decided to wait another turn for the Murktide. That way I can back it up with double protection spells. If I played it out right now, I'd have 1 interactive spell, and then they'd get to go to their turn with 5 mana. Could Calibrated Blast, could whatever. But if I wait 1 more turn, since I had the guaranteed land drop, then I can play out the Murktide like this, protect it with double spell, and hopefully that kind of runs them out of gas. And I'm just like left over with a Murktide. Here, our opponent's going to be nice and fetch and shock themselves down to Shadow Mortality range. If they've got another Leyline Binding, so be it. Like, I'll take the bad beat there. But I really don't want them to have this Shadow of Mortality on board. Even though I guess technically I race it, but if they have a bolt, then I have to like fight over a bolt, and I really don't want to do that. So on to round number 2. Reasonable opening hand. We're on the draw, but we do have like some 1 mana counter spells. We've got a Street Wraith to help find some more stuff. Archmage's Charm is like our card advantage spell. So got a little bit. Looks like opponents on the mono black Cabal Coffers deck. They suspend a Profane Tutor, so almost assuredly that's what they're doing. We have seen a huge, huge uptick in this deck recently. Holding on to my fetches so they don't get a Field of Ruin target, because I really don't want them to make this like Cabal Coffers better than it already is. And I do have the ability to like fight over this Profane Tutor on their turn, and if they go for like Land Karn, I can soft stub that. I know that they can't play enough swamps right here to get Cabal Coffers above Stubborn Denial range. So all I'm trying to do is like get to my next turn, so now I can start holding up Archmage's Charm as a hard counter, or I could play out the Murktide and have double Stubborn Denial backup, which is what we're doing here. My life total doesn't really matter here. Honestly, I miscounted at this point. I was like, oh, well, if I fetch and shock and whatever and use the floating mana, I can Archmage's Charm and I'll have an island left over to counter something on their turn. And then I fetched and shocked and was like, wait, 1, 2, dang, I can't Archmage's Charm. So instead, we're just going to play the tempo game with the Murktide. Like, most of their ways of dealing with a Murktide are going to be fairly expensive. We're talking like Damnations, kick. I wasn't expecting Bloodchief's Thirst. I was expecting like the Black Invoke, something like that, where it's going to cost most, if not all of their turn to cast that spell. So I feel like if we're able to 1 for 1 for a few turns, then maybe I can find my way into like a Shadow or another Murktide to grow the first Murktide, whatever the case may be. But now that we're getting to like 3 turn clock with a Murktide and we got 3 counter spells with 2 cards in their hand, I feel like we've got a reasonable chance. Especially now that we can counter spell like a an Archon of Cruelty. Opponent's going to drop I think this is like the Black March here. Uh, Smart of them. They cast the March for 7. They didn't need to, but like X is 6, which was one more card than they had in their graveyard. So they played around Drown in the Lock really well. Fortunately, we had the counter spell, and then we got to drown the invoke despair. So worked out in our favor in the end, but that was a heads up play by our opponent to march for more than we could cover. Here, kind of the same thing as that calibrated blast matchup. Like I've got a couple turns to set up here because my opponent's really not doing anything scary for the first turn or two. So I've got the ability to like take advantage of this consider, find wraiths, find whatever else. We get to top deck a chalice here, which means that we are chalicing the profane tutor on suspend. Luckily, we don't care too much about Relic of Progenitus. I didn't go over the sideboarding, but it's basically just all the removal spells out, the pushes, dismembers, that stuff, bringing in like Flusterstorm, the extra Stubborn Denial, brought in Turok, like a reasonable enough 2-for-1. So I know my opponent has got a Blood Chief's Thirst and a Karn, the Great Creator, in hand. I do want to point out this turn because I have the ability to kick Turok, or I can like play out Shadow, hold up counter spell. I decided that kicking Turok while they still had 2 cards in hand was like my highest upside. If they do crack both of their relics or crack a relic to try to save the Karn or something, honestly, I'm pretty okay with that because that means I get to untap, attack down the Karn with Turok. If they do get like a bridge, I've got counter spell. If they get something else that they can play right away, I can Brazen Borrower to bounce it, counter spell it on the way back down. So I feel like I've really got all of my bases covered, even if they protect the Turok with the draws. Or protect the Karn with the draws, but they end up ditching the Karn. So I know this relic's going to be 2 blind draws, and that's pretty okay with me too. The very best thing they can hit is like uh land invoke despair, which means I just get to untap with like shadow and counter spell, and the shadow is like a 2-turn clock. But they find Thoughtseize for my counter spell, push my Turok. I find another counter spell, get shadow down, which means like we're kind of sailing from here. I don't think there's a ton they can do in this one turn. Flusterstorm is just to make them tap out completely to pay for that, which means that I know this counterspell is safe with no follow-up. I could go for the counterspell first and hold up the Flusterstorm, but maybe there's some 2-mana non-instant or sorcery card that stops whatever I'm trying to do. Like, I just figured tapping them out and counterspelling is safer. So, but we're on to match number 3. We're on the play another 1-lander. You see that a lot in this deck, where you just have these hands that like you need a second land, but the rest of the hand is so good. Like Wraith, Thoughtseize, Shadow, Dismember. Really tough to throw that back. So we Thoughtseize, see Scion of Draco, and Ragavan and a bunch of lands. Take the Scion, dismember the Ragavan. We get down to Shadow, but they do find a Leyline Binding in a second Scion. Not the best situation for us, but not terrible. Like we get to either Brazen Borrower, Petty Theft the Scion, or hold up Counterspell. I'm pretty sure I elect to go ahead and Petty Theft the Scion, so that I don't put myself dead to like double burn spell out of them. And I think they just replay with like a Wild Nicodle and a Scion. I figure if they didn't have a Leyline Binding last turn, they probably don't have one this turn. So after I attack and they don't block, I'm just going for the dress down. Go for the kill there. I'm pretty positive they drew the Wild Nicottle for turn there. Sideboarding against Zoo, bring in like the extra dress downs because it takes out Kavu really, really well. Uh, boarding out like I think a couple Thoughtseize and some Street Wraiths because life total does very much matter against the deck with Tribal Flames. So Spreading Seas was to hopefully take them off of red, but obviously with Ragavan and Esteem Vents, it doesn't matter too much. But we do just get some shadows down, and having shadows pretty reasonable. Attack with a Neshoba Brawler. I'm going to make them assign damage correctly, which they don't. So my shadow gets to live. So I make this attack in with like the idea that, okay, I'm not dead on the crackback to Wild Nicottle and Scion. Maybe I put myself in a situation where they decide they have to block like a shadow with the Nicottle, keep the Scion alive. I was not expecting them to block both of my threats. If they had double blocked one of them, I would have tried to steal the Nicottle with the Archmage's Charm. So I was kind of thinking that might be a possibility. But I was really expecting it to just be like chump with the Wild Nicottle, ignore a shadow. But I just showed them lethal last game with a dress down on a shadow at 13 life. So I'm guessing that was still fresh in mind. They didn't want to be dead to that. So they blocked each, which just sets me up in like phenomenal position. I don't care about this Ragavan attack because they are dead on the crackback. There's not really anything they hit off of my library that I'm particularly scared of, and I've got double counterspell if they do. If they had just played out the Ragavan like hard cast, I would have tried to steal it. So this is match number 3. We finally get to see Search for Azcanta in hand. But we're against Living End, which means we are never playing out this Search for Azcanta on turn 2 in the blind. The double Murktide's a little rough. Like, there's probably a very good argument for this hand being a mulligan. Because it's basically a mull to 6 anyway, but it's a mull to 6 with like Fatal Push, Drown. Our opponent would take the Drown in the Lock with the Grief. Unfortunately, they've got the Grief plus the Living End, so we're just gonna scoop to that. We can't overcome that board state. Sideboarding against Living End, taking out pushes, dismembers, bringing in like Stubborn Denial, Chalice of the Void, Bluster Storms, all that sort of stuff. We do get another hand with Search for Azcanta, so we're actually going to get to cast out the Search this game and see how that does. Obviously, finding Flusterstorm is nice. Now we have some interaction of some sort. But it is cycling like crazy. We find a Thoughtseize, and this is like that heart sink moment. Like, all right, we Thoughtseize you and see 4 cascade effects. So I'm pretty sure we end up taking a Shardless Agent more for the fact that I don't have any way of dealing with the bodies and I don't have a threat. So I'm thinking like I can kind of fight over the violent outburst, but I don't have a way of dealing with the Shardless Agent. So them just having like 2 4/4s would likely beat me. But we do get to get down Murktide, which means we've got Murktide plus Flusterstorm held up. We do have them on a 2-turn clock. Unfortunately, they do have Otawara in hand and find another Shardless agent. So we have to counter this. Get to hit them for 7, but they still have 2 Cascade spells. Now, the thing I don't know is whether they have 3 or 4 copies of Living End. Like, some decks used to run 3. I think most are on 4 nowadays, but I could be very wrong on that. Either way, our opponent does get to hit us with some Shardless agents. They get Violent Outburst, so kind of in some trouble. I believe I messed up by casting the Thoughtseize here. I really don't think it mattered. And it put me dead to Shardless Agent plus like Violent Outburst for the pump. I was kind of just like hoping they either wouldn't see it or wouldn't go for it, but there's not really a big reason for them not to go for it. But either way, if they just cast the Violent Outburst and they had Living End, I couldn't beat that. So a little rough. We just found all of our expensive counters instead of the cheap ones, and then them having like the Otawara. Round number 4, get Yawgmoth. So we Thoughtseize, see Ignoble, Yawgmoth, and Strangleroot. I take the Strangleroot because I've got the kill spell for the Ignoble to really slow down this whole plan for Yawgmoth. And here we're just praying no Grist on turn 3. If we can dodge Grist right here, we feel kind of okay. Obviously, like we can't stop a Grist with Stubborn Denial unless they cord for it, but one step at a time. Them passing there makes me think that they were either playing around Counterspell. They could have a cord like this, which cord for 2 doesn't matter that much, but this Stubborn Denial is like not hitting anything else, so I might as well attack the cord. That kind of forces them into the Yawgmoth here because they just don't have anything else going on, which means they sack and we kill the Yawgmoth. And now there's not a ton left. Dismember the Yawgmoth so that we can fatal push the wolf if need be, but it is what it is. Sideboarding, board out these Stubborn Denials, board into like Dress Downs, board in the Go for the Throats, all of our interaction. Reasonable hand. We got some spot removal. We've got a threat. Our opponent's on a super low mole, which means, of course, they have Wall of Roots into Veil of Summer. So we're just going to untap, go ahead and kill the wall, because like we really just want to slow down their progression. They have a Grist here. It would kind of suck. Thankfully, they don't. So we're just going to get down our Murktide, because I feel like if they had a Grist, they would have resolved it last turn. And since they didn't, this just gives them like one blind draw step to rip the Grist. And if they don't, then we're just going to hold up Archmage's Charm for like the rest of the game. Because basically, if it doesn't say Grist, we really don't care about it. We're not losing the race to this young wolf. We can counter the Yawgmoth because we still have another counterspell available in case they do find a Grist. And they're on just a 2-turn clock, about to be a 1-turn clock. And we've got an Archmage's Charm. So really don't think there's anything they can top deck here to get out of this, but might as well let them have the opportunity anyway, right? All right. So ended up that league 4-1, lost to Living End, which is unfortunate. That should be a pretty good matchup. Let's skip to the end here. Living End is usually a really good matchup, so losing that one kind of stings a bit. But I did have kind of a a bad hand on the play. So I do give myself a little bit of a slap on the wrist for that one. But otherwise, like some of the notable spells in the deck, tried out. Ah, oh man, called a burp there. Tried out the search for Azcanta. We saw it twice, and it never really felt like there was a time I aggressively wanted it down. So I think for me, the fact that there was no time in that league that all I could think was like, I want search for Azcanta. And when I did see it, I only wanted to play it half the time I saw it. And the one time I did see it and I did want to play it and it didn't accomplish anything. Makes me think I'm going to write off search for Azcanta pretty quickly. I think the 2-mana sorcery speed in a deck that like wants to hold up interaction at 2 mana is a big ask. And especially in a format where like Living End and Rhinos are very, very popular, means that 50% of the time against those decks, you're going to be on the draw. And if you're on the draw turn 2 with Azcanta, you're never playing it because you're holding up Counterspell for a turn 3 Cascade spell. So if you're not playing out Azcanta on turn 2, it just gets like exponentially worse the longer you wait to play it out. So if you have the card and you're not playing it at the optimal time, why are you playing the card? Is kind of how I'm looking at that. Brazen Borrower, I think, was fine. Like, we did get to bounce a Scion of Draco. I've really liked having the Brazen Borrower in the deck. I think it helps out in a lot of situations that you don't otherwise have answers for. So I'm kind of interested in keeping it, but I can also see the merit for the 4th Murktide Regent to improve the rate at which you find a threat, which is absolutely one of the spots that the deck lacks consistency around. Other than that, Flusterstorm was fine out of the board. Stub was fine. Spreading Seas was reasonable. Like, we didn't see heavy Spreading Seas matchups, but we did see Mono Black and Zoo and technically a Witch's Cottage deck. So 3 out of our 5 matchups, Spreading Seas was a positive effect against. I won't say it was like a game-ending effect, but it was positive. And that's about all we can really ask for a sideboard card. Go for the Third was reasonable, except when our opponent had Scion of Draco. Fatal Push was good. Chalice did get to stop a suspended Profane Tutor. So that was good. Turok was reasonable. Spoiler alert, if you watch this video before the second video, Subtlety shows up in the second video. So we didn't really see Subtlety matchups this league, but next league, Subtlety is going to make an appearance. Only changes I would make to the main deck: drop the search for Azcanta, probably go up to like the 4th Drown, maybe the 4th Murktide. The 3 Fatal Push, I'm still really on the edge about. Like, I enjoy having the 2nd Dismember. It does lead to some explosive kills with Shadow. It's also really good if you're expecting a lot more scam to be able to hit like a Undying Fury or Grief or something like that. But the more I see Ragavan decks, the more I want the 4th Fatal Push in the main deck. So I just want to keep an eye on that as these leagues go along. Like, if you're cutting on a Fatal Push and we're cutting on a Drown in the lock, that puts us a little bit worse against like turn 1 Ragavan. And that card's like already extraordinarily popular in Modern and a nightmare for us to see. So I don't know if that's a card I'm okay like losing more percentage points to. But again, spoiler alert, second video, we see a little bit more Ragavan, so be prepared for that. Otherwise, yeah, we'll have the link to the video in the description down below, as well as the Twitch channel. So if you ever want to come check out a live stream, that's the place to do it. Hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe. Enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.